Think Cowboys ate steak and beans every night? Not even close. Out on the open range, there were no saloons, no menus, and no mercy. Dinner came from whatever you could hunt, fry, or boil in a rusty pot. From fried rattlesnake to vinegar pie, these meals weren't just wild, they were survival. No repeats, no fluff. Just 25 real meals Cowboys actually ate while riding through dust and danger. And trust me, some of these will make you gag, some will make you hungry, and a few might just make you miss the Wild West. Let's get to it. 1. Campo, camp bread. Don't let the name fool you. This wasn't soft, fluffy bread. Campo was a dense, no-nonsense flatbread made from flour, lard, salt, and baking powder. No yeast, no rise, no frills. Just mix pat and bake it in a skillet over open flame until it was browned or burned, depending on cookie's mood. It was the go-to starch on the trail, fast, filling, and tough enough to survive a week in a saddlebag. Cowboys used it to mop up grease, cradle stew, or just gnaw on dry during long rides. It didn't spoil, didn't crumble, and didn't need refrigeration, which made it just about perfect for life on the range. And if you were real lucky, Cookie might toss in a pinch of wild herbs or smear a dab of leftover bacon fat across the top before baking, turning this rugged trail bread into the closest thing Cowboys got to a dinner roll. Was it pretty? Number. But it was warm, it was heavy, and it didn't complain when you swore at it. 2. Chuckwagon fried steak. Every now and then, a steer went lame, got sick, or just keeled over in the dust, and when that happened, Cowboys didn't waste time mourning. They sharpened their knives. Because if you can't ride it, you might as well fry it. Chuckwagon fried steak wasn't your tender marbled T-bone. It was usually a tough cut hacked straight off the carcass, slapped into a hot skillet, and fried in beef tallow until it was brown, crusty, and hopefully chewable. Salt if you had it. Pepper if you were blessed. Otherwise, just heat, meat, and hope. Most trail cooks didn't bother with flour or batter. This wasn't chicken fried steak. This was survival steak. Sizzling grease, smoke in your eyes, and a slab of beef on a battered iron pan while 20 men stared at you like wolves. You cooked it fast, served it hot, and prayed nobody broke a tooth. It was also a rare morale booster. A fried steak dinner meant something had died, but not you. And on the open range, that was reason enough to celebrate. 3. Fried beef liver and onions. Let's be honest, liver isn't winning any popularity contest today, but on the open range, it was gold. Because when a steer went down, the liver was one of the first things Cookie cut loose and slapped into the skillet. It was rich, it was iron-packed, and it let the Cowboys pretend they were eating something gourmet, if they closed their eyes real hard and ignored the texture. Slice it thin, toss it in hot grease, and fry it up with some wild onions for flavor. Or regular onions, if the Chuckwagon was lucky enough to be stocked. Either way, it smelled amazing, like meat and smoke and something vaguely medicinal. The texture was, well, liver. A little rubbery, a little creamy, a lot intense. Some Cowboys loved it. Others just loved that it wasn't beans. But no one complained because fresh meat was fresh meat, and if Cookie fried it right, it was halfway decent, especially after a week of chewing on rock-hard bread and regret. 4. Oxtail Stew. When a steer was butchered, no part went to waste, including the tail, which just so happened to make one of the richest stews on the trail. Oxtail was packed with collagen and flavor, but it took time. Hours of slow simmering over open flame until the meat fell off the bone and the broth turned thick enough to stick to your ribs. Add some potatoes or wild onions if you had them. But even bare bones, this stew was a Cowboy classic. The best part? That gelatinous, fall-apart texture that made even the toughest cowpoke slow down and savor it. It wasn't fancy, just bone, broth, and grit. But out there under the stars, It tasted like you'd robbed a hotel kitchen. You didn't just eat oxtail stew, you respected it. Because when Cookie had the time and fuel to cook something this slow, you knew it was a good day to be alive. And let's be real. Any dish that made the Cowboys sit quiet for a minute instead of complaining about sore saddles or stubborn cattle, that was a stew worth remembering. 5. Venison or Antelope stew. Out on the open range, beef wasn't always on the menu, especially when it belonged to the rancher's herd and not your stomach. But wild game, fair game. When a cowboy got lucky with his rifle, deer or pronghorn antelope became dinner. The meat was lean, sometimes tough, but stewed low and slow. It turned into something almost tender, especially with a few onions, wild herbs, or a rogue potato tossed in. The flavor was bold, a little earthy, and definitely different from beef, which made it feel like a feast, even if it was just meat and water in a dented pot. And unlike salted meat, this was fresh, juicy, and didn't squeak when you chewed it. Every cowboy remembered the days they landed a deer on the trail. Not just because it filled the pot, but because it broke the monotony. In a world of repetitive meals, this was a rare dose of wild freedom. And if Cookie managed to stretch it over 2 nights, that man earned a second cup of coffee in the front spot by the fire. 6. Ash roasted potatoes. When a cowboy couldn't afford meat, or just didn't catch any, he turned to the ground, literally. Potatoes were cheap, travel-friendly, and tough enough to survive weeks in the Chuckwagon without rotting. All you had to do was toss them straight into the coals of a dying fire and forget about them for an hour. No pot, no pan, no fuss, just ash, ember, and patience. The skin would blacken and blister, but inside. Soft, smoky, and buttery, even without butter. Cowboys cracked them open with a pocket knife, added salt, or bacon grease if they had it, and dug in. Some even liked the burnt bits, said it tasted like home, if home was on fire. It wasn't glamorous, but when the sun dipped low and your bones ached from the saddle, a hot, ash-roasted spud felt like a miracle wrapped in soot. And if someone had a tin of chili flakes, dried herbs, or even a pinch of coffee grounds to sprinkle on top, well, that was frontier seasoning at its finest. And the best part, no dishes. Just kick the ash and ride on. 7. Cornmeal dumplings in wild onion broth. When flour ran out and meat was a ghost of a dream, cowboys made do with cornmeal again. But this time, they turned it into dumplings dropped into a hot foraged onion broth. It was humble, sure, but it was warm, filling, and smelled better than most trail hands after a week in the saddle. The broth came from boiling down wild onions, garlic if you had it, and whatever herbs could be yanked from the dirt nearby. Into that went spoonfuls of cornmeal dough, just water, salt, and fat, which puffed up like little yellow clouds bobbing around a muddy pond. It wasn't exactly saloon fare, but when you'd been riding all day and your stomach was chewing through your belt, it felt like something your grandma might make if she were broke and riding with a Winchester. Every spoonful was soft, savory, and just greasy enough to remind you it wasn't health food. It was trail food, meant to keep your legs working and your hands steady on the reins. 8. Cactus Pad Hash. Out in the desert, stretches where trees were rare but cacti were plenty, cowboys turned to the unlikeliest of ingredients, prickly pear pads, also known as nopales. You just had to be brave enough to dodge the spines and smart enough to slice them right. Once the needles were scraped off with a blade or burned off in fire, the cactus pads were chopped into strips and tossed into a hot skillet with onions, lard, and whatever scraps of meat might have survived the night. It wasn't pretty, and it sure didn't smell like a saloon roast, but it was zesty, filling, and surprisingly high in nutrients. Not that anyone was counting carbs out there. Cowboys weren't picky. If it grew in the dirt and didn't kill you, it went in the pan. Some even mixed in dried chilies or a pinch of beans from last night's fire to bulk it up. The texture? A little strange. The flavor? Bright, earthy and just enough to wake up your trail-weary soul. 9. Pan-seared turtle with riverbank greens. You'd be amazed what a hungry cowboy could turn into dinner. And when the trail ran near a creek or river, turtles were fair game. Slow to escape and packed with protein, these shelled swimmers made for a surprisingly tasty open-range meal. The meat was tricky to clean, took a steady hand and a bit of grit. But once you got past the armor, turtle flesh was tender, somewhere between chicken and fish, with a flavor that whispered, "I didn't plan for this, but I'm glad I did." Cowboys would pan-sear it in grease with garlic or wild onion if they had it, then toss in whatever greens they could scavenge from the riverbank, usually dandelion, sorrel, or watercress. You could eat it right off the skillet with a belt knife, still sizzling, juice dripping, steam rising like a prayer to the prairie gods. Most townsfolk wouldn't touch turtle, said it was too swampy. But cowboys didn't care about opinions. They cared about full bellies and a warm fire. 10. Pan-fried apples and salt pork. When your supplies were down to one bruised apple and a chunk of greasy salt pork, you didn't complain. You got creative, and pan-fried apples and pork became one of those weird cowboy combos that didn't just work. It was downright slapped. Cowboys would slice the pork into thick strips and fry it in a skillet until the edges curled and popped like bacon on payday. Then they'd toss in sliced apples, wild if they were lucky, dried and soaked if they weren't, and let them sizzle in the leftover fat until soft, golden, and caramelized at the edges. The salty-sweet mix was a happy accident that stuck around, especially in cooler months when fruit was rare and flavor was even rarer. Sometimes Cookie would add a splash of cider vinegar or a pinch of cinnamon if he was feeling generous, but most of the time it was just apples, pork, and heat. Cowboy comfort food that reminded you life didn't have to be pretty to be good. 11. Ash roasted corn in husk. When the fire was dying down and bellies were rumbling, cowboys would toss ears of corn, husks and all, straight into the hot ashes like it was second nature. No boiling, no butter. Just fire, smoke, and a prayer it didn't burn to a crisp. This was field corn, not the sweet kind. And it was usually picked right off the stalk from nearby farms or swiped from someone's unattended crop. The husks protected the kernels from charring too fast, locking in steam while the flames did their work. 10 minutes later, you'd have a hot, smoky ear of corn that popped when you bit in and stuck in your teeth like a bad memory. Some cowboys added salt if they had it. Others rubbed it with animal fat after cooking, but most just blew off the ash and dug in with dirty hands and a satisfied grunt. It wasn't gourmet, but it was fresh, fast, and didn't need a single pot or pan. And for a man who hadn't eaten anything green in a week, those blackened husks might as well have been wrapping gold. 12. Dried pea soup with fat back. Pea soup might sound like something your grandma made when you were sick, but on the open range, it was survival in a pot. Cowboys carried dried split peas because they were light, cheap, and didn't spoil, even after weeks of rattling around in a saddlebag with sand, sweat, and gunpowder. The recipe was simple. Dump the peas into a pot, add water from the nearest stream, filtered through whatever hat or sock you had on hand. Toss in a slab of fat back, that thick, salty strip of cured pork belly, and let it bubble until the peas broke down into something between a stew and a paste. It wasn't pretty, it wasn't quick, but it stuck to your ribs like wet denim and warmed your bones even when the wind was howling through your tent flaps. Some trail cooks would throw in onions or wild herbs if they came across any, but most of the time it was just peas, pork, and the unmistakable smell of something cooking that wasn't jerky. 13. Smoked venison sausage. When cowboys rode through forested regions or teamed up with local trappers, venison was a prized score, but turning it into sausage was a frontier flex. They'd grind the meat by hand or chop it fine, mix it with wild herbs like sage or juniper, and stuff it into cleaned animal casings. The sausages were then smoked over low-burning wood fires, hung to dry, and packed for the trail. Unlike jerky, these sausages were juicy, flavorful, and long-lasting, perfect for a cowboy who wanted something better than beans but didn't have time to cook a stew. Eaten cold, warmed on a skillet, or skewered over the flames, smoked venison sausage was rich, smoky, and filling, a rare mix of luxury and survival packed into one bite. You could even slice one straight from your saddlebag and eat it mid-ride. No fire, no plate, no fuss. For a cowboy riding solo through rough country, that kind of ready-to-eat comfort was worth more than gold. 14. Trail grits with bacon drippings. Grits weren't just for southern kitchens. They made their way onto the open range, too. Cowboys liked them because they were light to carry, easy to cook, and filled your belly fast. All it took was boiling water, a handful of ground corn, and a good stir. But what made them taste like something special? Bacon drippings. After frying up a few strips of bacon, if you were lucky enough to have some, the leftover grease got poured right into the pot of grits. That salty, smoky flavor turned plain mush into a meal worth sitting down for. Some cowboys added salt or a pinch of dried herbs if they had any, but most were just happy it wasn't beans again. It stuck to your spoon, filled your gut, and didn't take much firewood or effort. Just a pot, some patience, and something to scrape the bottom with. And when you're halfway to nowhere with nothing but dust and daylight behind you, a bowl of hot grits hits like a warm handshake from home. 15. Antelope marrow toast. When cowboys lucked into an antelope kill, they didn't just go for the meat, they went straight for the bones. Why? Because inside those long antelope legs was a rich, buttery marrow that could keep a man going through days of rough riding. They'd split the bones with a hatchet or smashed them with rocks, scoop out the marrow, and heat it in a skillet until it turned into a bubbling, golden oil. Then, they'd smear it over fire-toasted sourdough or corn cakes if they had 'em, or even on flat stones used like makeshift plates. The taste? Deep, smoky, and greasy in the best way, like nature's cowboy butter. It was rich enough to silence hunger and rare enough to feel like a feast. Some old-timers swore it kept your joints greased and your aim steady. Cowboys treated marrow like a secret weapon, the kind of thing only the old hands knew to look for. If you were green on the trail and saw a rider scraping bone goo onto bread, you might have gagged until you took a bite. It was frontier umami packed with fat, salt, and survival. 16. Burnt ends and scrap skillet. Cowboys didn't waste a thing, not even the crispy bits stuck to the bottom of the pan. After a cookout, whatever was left, fat trimmings, burnt ends of meat, odd scraps of bacon or beef, went straight back into the skillet for a second round. They'd toss it all together, maybe add in a chunk of potato or some dried onion, then fry it in leftover grease until the whole thing was crackling hot and smoky. It wasn't pretty, but it sure was rich, salty, crunchy, and full of cowboy fuel. Some even scraped bits of biscuit or cornbread into the mix just to soak up the grease. It wasn't a planned meal. It was more like a cleanup job that turned into dinner. And somehow those random crispy pieces tasted better than the original roast. Maybe it was the hunger, maybe it was the fire, or maybe it was just the fact that cowboys knew how to make something out of nothing. They called it scrap hash, pan sweep, or just dinner. But it always disappeared fast. 17. Salted fish on coals. If a cowboy found himself near a river and lucky with a line, fish was on the menu. But out on the range, where ice was just a memory and time wasn't on your side, fresh fish didn't stay fresh for long. That's where salt came in. They'd catch whatever they could, trout, catfish, perch, gut it, salt it heavy, and hang it to dry for a day or two. Once it was firm and briny, it went straight onto hot coals, no pan needed, just flame, fish, and a stick. The skin would blister and blacken, but the meat inside, hot, flaky, and packed with that rich, salty bite that only came from cowboy-style curing. It wasn't fancy, and bones were part of the deal, but you got used to it quick. Sometimes they'd squeeze a bit of wild lemon or sprinkle some pepper if the Chuckwagon carried it, but most of the time it was just fish and fire, the way nature handed it over. 18. Fire-roasted wild onions. You wouldn't think onions could save a cowboy's day, but when you're out riding for weeks with nothing but beans and dried meat, a handful of wild onions felt like striking gold. They grew in bunches along creeks, riverbeds, and grassy plains. Cowboys knew how to spot them. Narrow stalks, strong smell, and a taste that hit like a mule kick. Once picked, they were tossed whole onto hot rocks or straight into the coals until the outer skins blackened and split. Inside, the bulbs turned sweet, soft, and smoky. Peel off the burnt layer, and what's left melted in your mouth like frontier candy. Some ate them alone, others stirred them into whatever else was cooking. Stew, grits, or even pan-scrap hash. They weren't filling, but they packed a punch of flavor that made even the plainest meal feel special. A little zing for a worn-out tongue, and after days of dust and dry bread, that bite of roasted onion tasted like civilization, even if you were 100 miles from the nearest town. 19. Lye-cured hominy. Before canned goods and boxed cornflakes, there was hominy, a hearty corn dish that took time, patience, and a little bit of cowboy chemistry. On the open range, cowboys would boil dried corn kernels with lye. Yep, the same stuff used for soap making to remove the husks and unlock a soft, chewy center. It wasn't exactly fast food, but once rinsed and cooked down, hominy became a belly-filling base that stuck to your ribs. They'd simmer it in a pot with water, a pinch of salt, maybe some tallow or bone broth if they were lucky. It turned into something between porridge and stew, mild, earthy, and surprisingly satisfying. Some added wild herbs, garlic, or leftover meat bits if they had 'em. Most didn't. It was simple, honest, and best of all, it kept a man moving long after breakfast was gone. Hominy didn't get headlines, but it earned respect. Because when the trail got rough and supplies got lean, corn that could take a beating and still feed the crew was worth its weight in gold. 20. Dried pumpkin chips. When fresh meat was scarce and the trail stretched on too long, cowboys reached for something unexpected: pumpkin. Not the pie kind. We're talking thick-skinned, wild-grown prairie pumpkins, sliced thin and sun-dried until they turned tough, leathery, and just sweet enough to chew on. It was trail candy with a bite. They'd shave the flesh into ribbons, lay it on rocks or hang it from saddle ropes, and let the sun do the cooking. No sugar, no salt, just natural drying and a whole lot of patience. Once dry, the chips were packed into pouches or bedrolls. They didn't rot, didn't spoil, and gave a slow-release chew that worked like nature's jerky, only without the meat. Some cowboys softened them back into stews or hot mash. Most just gnawed them plain, and after 3 days of nothing but beans and dust, even a pumpkin slice tasted like dessert. It was the kind of food you didn't brag about, but you sure were glad to have when the storms rolled in and the next town was 50 miles away. 21. Fire-baked acorn bread. Cowboys didn't always have flour on hand, but if they were passing through oak country, they sure had acorns. And with a little know-how and a lot of elbow grease, those bitter little nuts turned into a bread that kept them going for miles. First, you had to crack and shell the acorns, then soak or boil them for hours, sometimes days, to wash out the bitterness. Once they were mellowed, they'd be mashed into a rough flour or paste. Mix that with water and a bit of animal fat, then form it into thick patties and slap it on a hot rock by the fire. No yeast, no sugar, just survival in a crispy, nutty slab. It was dense, a little gritty, and had an earthy flavor that stuck with you, kind of like the trail itself. Cowboys ate it with beans, dipped it in stew, or just chomped it straight when the Chuckwagon was running lean. And while it wasn't anyone's favorite meal, it was dependable. And on the open range, that counted for more than taste. 22. Griddle fried liver slabs. When a steer was brought down, Cowboys didn't waste a thing, especially not the liver. Packed with nutrients and easy to cook fast, liver was the kind of fuel that kept a man in the saddle. They'd slice it thick, toss it on a greased skillet or hot griddle, and let it sear until the edges curled and the smell turned heads. No fancy seasoning, just a pinch of salt, a hit of black pepper if they had it, and maybe a splash of vinegar to cut the iron bite. It cooked fast, filled bellies quicker than stew, and gave tired cowboys a kick of energy when they needed it most. Sure, it was chewy. And yeah, the flavor hit like a punch to the teeth, but liver wasn't meant to be delicate. It was straight-up fuel for men who didn't have time to wait. And when paired with a swig of black coffee or a strip of dry bread, it was the kind of meal that reminded you life on the range wasn't about luxury. It was about lasting till sundown. 23. Roasted prickly pear pads. Out in the Southwest, where cacti outnumbered cows, cowboys turned to the land for survival. And that meant eating cactus. Not the needles, of course. They'd slice off the flat pads of the prickly pear, scrape off the spines with a knife or branding iron, and roast them right over the fire. What came out was a smoky, slightly tangy vegetable, soft in the middle with just enough bite to feel like food and not punishment. Sometimes they'd toss it with beans or wrap it in a cloth with a hunk of meat, but more often they just gnawed it plain, right off the coals like a piece of campfire squash. It wasn't pretty, and it sure wasn't what you'd call a delicacy. But it was green, fresh, and full of water, something mighty rare after days in the dry heat. When your canteen's running low and the only shade is under a thorn bush, a roasted cactus pad starts to look like a 5-star meal. 24. Dried corn and wild onion succotash. This wasn't your grandma's creamy succotash. This was cowboy-style dry skillet, slap-it-together succotash made from whatever was foraged or packed from camp to camp. Cowboys kept dried corn in their gear because it was lightweight, didn't spoil, and could be rehydrated fast with just a splash of water and a good boil. But when wild onions were in season, that's when this dish came alive. They'd chop up the onions, sharp, punchy, and foraged right from the edge of the trail, then fry them in a pan with a lump of tallow or bacon grease. Add in the soaked corn and maybe a handful of wild greens or even a few black beans if someone had a stash, and you had a skillet of color, crunch, and flavor that punched way above its weight. It was smoky, savory, and had just enough sweetness from the corn to feel like a treat. Not bad for a meal made with nothing but field scraps and fire. 25. Fire-baked apple and sage bannock. Out on the open range, dessert was a rare luxury, but every now and then a cowboy cook would pull off a miracle. Enter bannock, a simple flatbread of flour, water, and fat that could be slapped onto a hot rock or wrapped around a stick and cooked right in the coals. But the real magic happened when someone had apples, maybe dried slices from a trading post or wild crab apples picked along the trail, and a pinch of sage from the brush. They'd mash the fruit, stir it into the dough, and toss in a handful of chopped sage for a fragrant, earthy kick. Then the whole thing was flattened, wrapped in cloth or slapped in a skillet, and slow cooked until the outside was golden and the inside just barely set. It came